My racist principal tried to destroy my future. I watched Principal Tiger drag my friend out of the cafeteria by his collar because he'd overheard him saying, "Chow." 3 days suspension, Tiger spat, his eyes wild with fury. You see, Tiger demanded every student speak only English on school property, because according to him, foreign languages were a cancer that would destroy America's future. By 16, he'd turned our school into a surveillance state where one word in another language meant your life was over. The rule started my freshman year after some Korean kids supposedly cheated on a test by discussing answers in their language. Tiger held an assembly where he screamed for 40 minutes about how America was built by Americans using English, and anyone who couldn't respect that should leave. Teachers soon became language police, patrolling hallways with notebooks, marking down anyone whose lips moved wrong. Even whispering to yourself in the bathroom got reported because Tiger paid students $50 for turning in language violators. Chinese was all my family spoke at home, so school became 8 hours of swallowing my real voice. Mom worked as a prison guard where she couldn't answer calls, which made me Grandma's emergency contact. Grandma had heart problems and only spoke Chinese, but calling me during school meant risking everything. We developed a system where I'd answer with just mm-hmm and uh-huh while she talked, pretending someone English-speaking was on the other end. Tiger made the punishments worse every year. First offense was 3 days suspension plus a permanent record note that would follow you to college. Second offense meant losing any scholarships or sports eligibility. Third offense was expulsion. He installed security cameras with audio in every hallway and hired a tech kid to review footage for foreign words. Parents got banned from school property if they spoke anything but English, even in the parking lot. My friend Maria got suspended for saying "I" when she dropped her books because Tiger claimed it was Spanish. Another kid lost his valedictorian spot for humming a Vietnamese lullaby his mom used to sing. The Haitian kids stopped bringing lunch from home because the smell of their food made teachers suspicious they were speaking Creole in secret. We all walked around like ghosts of ourselves, our real voices rotting inside us. I lasted 3 years without a violation by being paranoid every second. When other kids tried to trick me into responding in Chinese as a joke, I'd pretend I didn't understand. When Grandma called during lunch, I'd hide in the janitor's closet whispering yes or no while she asked complex questions about her medications. Once she fell and called during chemistry, so I tapped out codes on the phone where 3 taps meant take your pills, and 5 meant call the neighbor. Then one day my phone vibrated nonstop during history class. My neighbor only had this number for emergencies with Grandma, and she'd called 38 times in 10 minutes. My hands shook as I slipped into the hallway and called back. My neighbor was screaming in Chinese that Grandma had collapsed and the paramedics couldn't understand which heart medication she took versus the one she was deathly allergic to. The medications had similar names, and my panicking neighbor kept mixing them up in broken English. I tried texting the names, but she couldn't read my screen to the paramedics while holding the phone. The paramedics were yelling for information in English. My neighbor was crying in Chinese, and Grandma was dying because no one could communicate. There was no clever workaround this time, no tapping system that would save her life. I ran down the empty hallway speaking rapid Chinese, explaining exactly where her medications were kept, which bottle was which, her dosage history, her allergies. My neighbor put me on speaker so I could translate directly to the paramedics, switching between languages so fast I couldn't track which one I was using. Medical terms poured out in whatever language I knew them in first while I sprinted to the parking lot. Tiger stood by the main exit with his phone raised, recording everything. His face was calm, like he'd been waiting for this moment, like he knew eventually someone would have to choose between his rule and a human life. I looked him right in the eyes and kept speaking Chinese, explaining how Grandma was allergic to penicillin, how the wrong medication would kill her in minutes, how she needed the white pills, not the blue ones. He smiled while filming me destroy my future with every Chinese word. Behind him, his office walls were covered with photos of expelled students, kids whose lives he'd ruined for speaking their parents' languages, trophy photos of destroyed futures. I was about to become another picture on his wall, but at least Grandma would be alive to know what I'd sacrificed. The paramedics saved her because I'd explained her allergies in time. The doctor said another 3 minutes and she would have died from the wrong medication. The next morning, Tiger was waiting in my first period class with his laptop open to the security footage. The whole room went silent as he played the video of me speaking forbidden words. He pulled out expulsion papers with my name already typed in, dated from the day before like he'd prepared them in advance. Did you think your grandmother's life was worth more than the rules? I stared at him without answering because what could I possibly say that would matter to someone who already had my expulsion papers typed up before I even broke his rule? The laptop screen showed me frozen mid-sprint in the hallway, my mouth forming Chinese words that saved my grandmother's life, and Tiger clicked a button that made the video appear on the projector behind him. The whole class turned to look at the wall where a giant version of me ran through empty corridors speaking rapid Chinese, my face twisted with fear and determination. Someone near the back whispered something I couldn't hear, and 3 other students pulled out their phones to record the screen. Tiger walked between the rows of desks carrying a stack of papers, his footsteps loud in the silent room, and when he reached my desk, he set the expulsion documents down in front of me with a soft thud. My name was already filled in at the top in neat computer font, and the date at the bottom said yesterday's date, proving he'd prepared this before the emergency even happened. He told me I had until 3 o'clock to sign the withdrawal papers and leave quietly, his voice calm like he was discussing homework instead of destroying my future. The paper felt heavy under my fingers as I touched the corner, and I watched my hands start to shake before I pulled them back into my lap. Every student in that room was staring at me now instead of the video, their eyes moving between my face and the expulsion papers, and I felt something shift inside my chest from shock into something colder and harder. The fear that had been choking me since yesterday transformed into rage that settled in my bones like ice, and I looked up at Tiger standing over my desk with his satisfied smile. The bell rang for the end of first period and everyone grabbed their bags, but they moved slowly, watching to see what I would do, and Tiger just stood there waiting for me to fold. I shoved the papers into my backpack without signing anything and pushed through the crowded hallway toward my locker. Between first and second period, I pulled out my phone with hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it twice, and I tried calling Mom even though I knew she'd already be at the prison. The phone rang 4 times before her voicemail picked up with her professional voice saying she wasn't available, and I hung up without leaving a message because what would I even say? The hallway felt like it was shrinking around me as students walked past whispering and pointing, some of them looking sympathetic but most just curious about the drama. I recognized 3 kids who'd reported other students for language violations, the ones who earned $50 each time they turned someone in, and they were smirking at me like I deserved what was coming. My chest got tight and my breathing went shallow, and I realized I was completely alone in this building where everyone either feared Tiger enough to stay silent or worked for him willingly. I ducked into the girls' bathroom and locked myself in the furthest stall, sitting on the closed toilet lid with my head between my knees. The panic hit me in waves that made my whole body shake, and I tried to breathe slowly like I'd learned in health class, but the air wouldn't go deep enough into my lungs. My mind raced through impossible options, each one worse than the last, signing the papers and losing everything I'd worked for, or fighting it, and probably losing anyway. The bathroom door opened and I heard 2 girls come in talking about me, saying I was stupid for not just letting the paramedics figure it out themselves, and I pressed my hands over my ears until they left. Third period history class felt like walking into enemy territory, but I went because skipping would just give Tiger more ammunition against me. Mr. Peters stood at the front organizing papers on his desk, and when students filed in, he started handing back our essays on civil rights movements. He worked his way through the rows calling names and returning papers with grades written in red ink at the top, and when he got to my desk, he paused for just a second. His eyes met mine and held contact longer than normal, maybe 3 full seconds instead of the usual glance, and then he tapped twice on the thick district policy handbook he was carrying under his other arm. The taps were deliberate and firm, loud enough for me to hear but quiet enough that other students wouldn't notice, and his face stayed completely neutral like nothing unusual was happening. Something in that gesture felt purposeful, like he was trying to tell me something without using words that could get him in trouble with Tiger's surveillance system. I reached for the handbook when he set it on my desk and slipped it into my bag next to the expulsion papers, confused about what he meant, but grateful for what might be the only kindness I'd get today. He moved on to the next student without any other acknowledgement, his expression carefully blank, and I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. The rest of class passed in a blur of notes about Supreme Court cases, while I sat there thinking about that handbook, and whether it contained something that could help me. At lunch, I got called to the office over the intercom, my name echoing through the cafeteria where everyone stopped eating to stare at me. I walked down the empty hallway to Tiger's office, feeling like I was heading toward an execution, and when I knocked, he told me to come in without looking up from his computer. The expulsion papers sat on his desk next to a black pen, positioned carefully in the center like props in a play he'd rehearsed. He gestured for me to sit in the chair across from him, and finally looked at me with an expression that was almost friendly, which somehow made everything worse. His voice came out calm and reasonable as he explained that signing now would keep this incident off my permanent record as an expulsion, and list it instead as a voluntary withdrawal for family reasons. He said it would be cleaner for everyone, easier for me to explain to colleges, and that fighting it would only make things harder and more public. I looked past him at the wall covered in photos of expelled students, dozens of faces of kids whose lives he'd destroyed for speaking their parents' languages, and something solidified in my chest. The word came out of my mouth before I fully decided to say it, a simple no that didn't shake or waver, and I watched his friendly expression disappear like someone had flipped a switch. His face went cold and hard, and he told me the formal hearing was scheduled for next Monday at 3, that I was making this much harder than it needed to be, that I'd regret not taking his offer. I stood up and walked out of his office without signing anything, my legs somehow steady even though my heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. By the time afternoon classes started, my phone was vibrating constantly in my pocket with texts from numbers I didn't recognize. Someone had posted about my situation on social media, and now everyone had opinions about whether I was a hero or a rule breaker who deserved what was coming. I checked during the break between classes and found the post had over 300 comments, some defending me and others saying I should have just let my grandmother die rather than break the rules. One comment said I was disrespecting America by speaking Chinese. Another said Tiger was a racist who should be fired, and most people just seemed excited about the drama. The comment section was brutal and mean, with students I'd never even talked to weighing in on whether my grandmother's life was worth more than following school policy. I scrolled through reading insults and support in equal measure until my hands started shaking again, and then I turned my phone completely off and shoved it to the bottom of my backpack. The rest of the day passed in a fog while I tried to focus on teachers talking about math and science, but all I could think about was Monday's hearing, and how I had no idea how to defend myself. After school, I sat in my car in the parking lot and turned my phone back on to try the neighbor again. She answered on the first ring, and her voice was warm and relieved as she told me Grandma was stable and resting at home, that the doctor said my quick translation about her medication allergies definitely saved her life. Relief flooded through me so powerfully I had to put my head down on the steering wheel, and for a few seconds I just breathed and felt grateful she was okay. But the relief lasted maybe 30 seconds before it got crushed under the weight of knowing that saving her might cost me everything I'd worked for since freshman year. I started the car and drove home on autopilot, my mind stuck on the impossible choice between right and safe, between protecting family and protecting my future. In Tiger's world, those two things could never be the same, and I'd chosen family knowing exactly what it would cost. The drive took 15 minutes through familiar streets, and I kept thinking about how the right choice and the safe choice are supposed to be the same thing, but they never are when you're dealing with people like Tiger who care more about rules than lives. When I got home, there was an official letter sticking out of the mailbox, a thick envelope with the school district logo printed in the corner. I pulled it out and carried it inside where Mom was already home early, sitting at the kitchen table still wearing her prison guard uniform. She must have left work the moment she got my messages, and her face looked tired and scared as I handed her the envelope. We opened it together and read the formal notice scheduling my expulsion hearing for next Monday at 3 p.m., requiring my parent or guardian to attend, listing all the policy violations, and potential consequences in cold administrative language that made it sound like I'd committed a crime. The letter said I had the right to bring representation, to review evidence against me, to present my own evidence and witnesses, but it didn't say how to do any of those things. Mom and I sat at the kitchen table reading and rereading the letter, while Grandma rested in the next room, and the hearing was in 6 days. But we had no idea how to fight this, or who could help us. Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand hard, her palm rough from years of physical work, and she told me we'd figure it out together even though neither of us believed it yet. That evening, the neighbor came over carrying a container of soup she'd made for Grandma, and she thanked me again for saving her life. She sat at our kitchen table and explained in detail how the paramedics were about to give Grandma the medication she was deathly allergic to before I called, how they'd had the wrong bottle in their hands and were seconds away from injecting it. She described how my rapid Chinese gave them the exact information they needed in time, how the white pills versus blue pills instruction prevented a fatal reaction that would have killed Grandma within minutes. The neighbor's voice got emotional as she talked, and she kept saying I was brave and did the right thing, that some rules aren't worth following when lives are at stake. Hearing her confirm that my choice was literally life or death made something settle in my chest, a certainty that even if I lost everything, I made the only choice I could live with. Mom cried quietly while the neighbor talked, and Grandma called out from her room asking what all the fuss was about, and we all laughed even though nothing was actually funny. Late that night, after everyone went to bed, I sat at my laptop researching school policies and district regulations and student rights. I clicked through page after page of dense legal documents that might as well have been written in another language for all I understood them. The district website had almost nothing about language access or emergency exceptions, just endless student conduct codes and disciplinary procedures that all seemed designed to protect the school instead of students. I found the section about expulsion hearings and tried to understand what evidence I could present and what my rights were, but the language was so formal and complicated, I couldn't figure out what any of it actually meant. I printed out anything that seemed possibly relevant, and the pages piled up on my desk covered in highlighted sections and notes in the margins. At 2 a.m., I finally fell asleep with my head on the keyboard, surrounded by printed pages and no closer to understanding how to defend myself, but determined to find something that would help before Monday came. The next morning in history class, Mr. Peters started discussing civil rights movements and the legal battles that changed discriminatory policies. He talked about Brown versus Board of Education, and how sometimes unjust rules need to be challenged through proper channels, and then he casually mentioned that the district has a language access policy for families that's supposed to ensure communication in emergencies. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he spoke slowly and clearly, repeating the phrase district language access policy twice like he wanted to make sure someone wrote it down. I grabbed my pen and scribbled the words in my notebook, underlining them 3 times, and my heart started beating faster because this was the first real lead I'd found. Mr. Peters moved on to talking about the Civil Rights Act without any other acknowledgement, but I kept staring at those words in my notebook, knowing they might be the thing that could help my case. After class, I went straight to the library computers and searched for district language access policy, and my first real hope started growing that maybe I wasn't completely defenseless after all. I printed out the district language access policy and stuffed it in my backpack, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline of finding something that might actually help. The library was nearly empty as I headed toward the exit, most students already gone for the day. I pushed through the double doors into the main hallway and immediately spotted the tech kid who reviews all the audio footage for Tiger. He was walking toward me about 20 feet away, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his eyes locked on his phone. The second our eyes met, his whole body went rigid. He looked away fast and changed direction, practically speed walking toward the nearest stairwell like he couldn't get away from me fast enough. My stomach dropped because that reaction confirmed everything I'd been suspecting. He was the one who flagged my Chinese conversation from the hallway footage. He was the one who gave Tiger the evidence to destroy my future. But the way he couldn't even look at me, the way he ran away, told me something else too. He felt guilty about it. He knew the context now, knew I'd been saving my grandmother's life, and it was eating at him. I filed that information away in my brain as potentially useful. Someone else trapped in Tiger's system who might want a way out. Someone who might be willing to help if I approached him carefully enough. I walked to my car feeling like I'd gained two important pieces today: the policy document and the knowledge that the tech kid's loyalty to Tiger might not be as solid as it seemed. The drive home felt longer than usual, my brain spinning through everything that had happened. Mom's car was already in the driveway when I pulled up, which was weird because she usually worked until 6. I found her sitting at the kitchen table with her work uniform still on, staring at her phone with this tight, worried expression. She looked up when I came in, and I could see she'd been crying. We sat down across from each other, and she started talking in this quiet, scared voice about what fighting this expulsion could cost our family. Her job at the prison was already hard enough as one of the only Asian guards, and she was terrified that making waves about discrimination at my school would somehow get back to her workplace. She explained how the prison system was all connected, how people talked, how standing out and being targeted could affect her job security and our income. I listened to her list all the ways this could go wrong and felt my own fear growing. But then something shifted in me, and I reminded her that staying silent meant accepting that Grandma's life was worth less than Tiger's rules. That if we didn't fight this, we were agreeing that I should have let Grandma die rather than speak Chinese to save her. Mom's face changed when I said that, something breaking through the fear. We argued for over an hour, both of us crying, going back and forth between terror and determination. She kept saying we could lose everything, and I kept saying we'd already lost everything if we accepted this. Finally, she reached across the table and grabbed my hand hard. We agreed we had to try, even though we were both scared out of our minds about what would happen if we lost. The next morning, I woke up with a plan forming in my head. I called the hospital where Grandma had been treated and asked to be transferred to interpreter services. The coordinator who answered sounded professional and kind, and when I explained I needed to understand how medical places handle language barriers in emergencies, she was happy to help. Then I described the school's English-only policy and what had happened to me. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long I thought we'd been disconnected. When she finally spoke again, her voice was filled with shock and anger. She explained that federal law requires hospitals to provide language access because lives literally depend on clear communication. She kept saying how insane it was that a school would punish emergency translation, how it violated every principle of emergency response. The validation I felt hearing her outrage on my behalf was overwhelming. She emailed me links to medical language access laws and regulations right while we were still on the phone. I thanked her about 5 times before hanging up, then spent the next hour reading through everything she'd sent. The documents highlighted exactly how crazy Tiger's policy was, how it went against established federal protections. Mom made some calls during her lunch break and got a referral from our community center to a civil rights lawyer named Mallory Rossi. The woman at the community center said Mallory had experience with discrimination cases and offered free first meetings. Mom texted me the appointment time, that same day at 6, and I spent the whole afternoon getting organized. I gathered the expulsion letter, wrote out a detailed timeline of everything that had happened, found the photos I'd secretly taken of Tiger's trophy wall last year, and took screenshots of the English-only policy from the student handbook. Every piece of documentation went into a folder that I checked 3 times to make sure I had everything. Walking into Mallory's office that night with Mom beside me, I felt nervous but also hopeful for the first time since Tiger had played that video. Maybe someone with actual legal knowledge could see a way through this mess. Mallory's office was small but organized, with law books covering one whole wall and a desk covered in neat stacks of papers. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back and these sharp, focused eyes that made me feel like she was really listening. She took detailed notes while Mom and I told her everything, asking specific questions about how the policy was enforced, about the surveillance system, about the exact emergency circumstances. Her questions were smart and pointed, making me explain details I hadn't thought were important. When we finished, she sat back and explained that Tiger's English-only policy likely violated both federal civil rights protections and state education codes. She said punishing emergency medical translation was legally impossible to defend. She used words like discriminatory impact and protected class status that I didn't fully understand, but that sounded powerful and official. Then she looked right at me and said we had a strong case if we were willing to fight it. Her confidence felt like oxygen after days of drowning. When she firmly told us not to sign anything and that she'd represent us for free, pro bono she called it, I felt hope crash through me so hard I almost started crying right there in her office. This was the first time since Tiger played that video that someone with actual power had told me I might win. The next morning, Mallory sent a formal letter to the school district. She forwarded me a copy and I read it 3 times, not understanding all the legal language but getting the main point. She was demanding that they preserve all records related to the English-only policy, halt my expulsion process, and provide proper procedures including access to all evidence against me. The letter cited specific laws and regulations, making it clear they were dealing with someone who knew exactly what she was doing. I felt something shift inside me reading that letter. I wasn't just a scared student anymore. I had real legal backing and rights that had to be respected. The power balance had changed, even if just a little bit. By afternoon, the retaliation started, and it was obvious and petty. A teacher I barely knew confiscated my phone during lunch, claiming I was using it wrong, even though I was literally just checking the time. Then I noticed a hall monitor following me between classes. This guy who'd never paid attention to me before, now taking notes on his clipboard about my movements. I texted Mallory about both incidents, and she responded immediately telling me to document everything. So I started a detailed log with timestamps and witness names for each thing that happened. Every time they tried to intimidate me, I wrote it down. The surveillance system they'd used to control me was becoming a tool I could use against them. Their intimidation tactics were turning into evidence of their hostility toward me. That same night, Mallory filed a formal complaint with the superintendent's office. She called to explain what she'd done, how the complaint detailed the English-only policy's discriminatory impact, and my specific case. She'd requested an immediate investigation and asked them to suspend the disciplinary proceedings pending review. She explained this put pressure on the district administration above Tiger's level, forcing them to treat this as a serious legal matter instead of just a school discipline issue. I could feel my anxiety changing into something sharper and more focused. Each legal step made the fight feel more real and more winnable. We weren't just hoping things would work out. We were building an actual case with strategy and documentation. Over the next few days, social media exploded with posts about my situation. Some students created supportive posts with hashtags about language rights and defending me. Others posted long arguments defending Tiger's policy as necessary for school safety and American values. The comment sections were brutal, with people I'd never met having strong opinions about whether I was brave or just a rule breaker who deserved what was coming. Mallory told me firmly to stay completely off social media, to let others argue while I focused on the legal case and my own mental health. The loneliness of being at the center of this huge controversy while staying silent was really hard. I wanted to defend myself, to argue back, to make people understand, but I accepted it as necessary protection. Every time I felt the urge to post something, I reminded myself that Mallory knew what she was doing. Grandma came home from her follow-up appointment with good news about her heart being stable. I spent that whole night cooking dinner with her, helping her organize her medications into the daily pill boxes, falling into our familiar routines. We talked in Chinese the entire time, freely and naturally, without fear or codes or whispered yes and no answers. Being able to speak fully at home, to be my whole self without monitoring every word, reminded me exactly what I was fighting for. The right to exist in both my languages without having to choose between them. Grandma told me she was proud of me for standing up, that my generation shouldn't have to hide like hers did. She said her generation had stayed quiet and small to survive, but that I was showing a different way was possible. Her words made me feel stronger and more certain that fighting this was worth whatever it cost. Monday morning, I walked into history class trying to act normal while my stomach twisted with nerves about the hearing coming up in 5 days. Mr. Peters was already at his desk organizing papers, and students filed in around me talking about weekend plans like everything was fine. I pulled out my notebook and tried to focus on looking busy while my mind raced through worst-case scenarios. During independent work time, Mr. Peters walked between desks checking on progress, and when he reached my desk, he paused for just a second. His hand moved quickly, sliding a folded piece of paper under my notebook before he kept walking without making eye contact. My heart jumped because the move was so careful and quiet, like he didn't want anyone to see. I waited until he was on the other side of the room before unfolding the paper in my lap, where other students couldn't see. It was a printed email dated 2 years ago with Tiger's name at the top, sent to all staff with the subject line, Language Policy Enforcement Guidelines. I scanned the text quickly, my hand starting to shake as I read Tiger's words telling teachers they must report any non-English language use immediately. The worst part was a line that said, cultural accommodation undermines educational standards and creates security vulnerabilities. This wasn't just one principal making random decisions. This was proof he'd created a whole system on purpose. I pulled out my phone under my desk and took 3 photos of the memo from different angles to make sure every word was clear. My fingers fumbled with the screen as I attached the photos to a text to Mallory, with just the words, Mr. Peters gave me this. I hit send and felt my chest get tight thinking about what Mr. Peters had just risked for me. If anyone found out he'd given me that email, Tiger would destroy him the same way he destroyed students. The bell rang, and I carefully folded the paper and tucked it into the inside pocket of my backpack where it wouldn't get crushed. Mr. Peters didn't look at me as I left, but I caught him watching me from the corner of his eye, his face worried. Walking to my next class felt different because now I had actual proof that this policy came from the top and was enforced on purpose. That afternoon, during lunch, my phone buzzed with Mallory's name on the screen. I ducked into an empty classroom and answered, my voice coming out shaky. She told me the memo was exactly what we needed, that it proved systematic enforcement rather than isolated incidents. Her voice was excited in a controlled lawyer way, explaining how this showed intent and policy rather than just individual actions. Then she told me I needed to start keeping a detailed retaliation log right away, documenting every single instance of extra scrutiny or unfair treatment I experienced. She wanted dates, times, staff members involved, specific actions taken, and any witnesses present. I grabbed a notebook and started writing down the format she described while she talked. When I got home that afternoon, I opened a new spreadsheet on my laptop and created columns for date, time, location, staff member, action taken, witnesses, and notes. Just making the spreadsheet made me feel less powerless, like I was doing something productive instead of just taking abuse. I went back through the last week in my memory and started filling in entries. October 15th, 10:30 a.m., hallway near cafeteria. Hall monitor followed me for 3 minutes taking notes. October 16th, 2:15 p.m., math class. Teacher confiscated my phone when I was checking the time. October 17th, 8 a.m., main entrance. Vice principal watched me walk through metal detector twice. Each entry I typed made the pattern more obvious. They were watching me constantly, looking for any excuse to write me up again. But now, instead of just feeling paranoid, I had documentation. After school, I had to stay late for a makeup test, and when I finally left the building around 4:30 p.m., I spotted Coach Manley near the gym entrance. He was locking up equipment, and I almost walked past without saying anything, but something made me stop. I asked if I could talk to him for a minute, and he looked around the empty parking lot before nodding. We stood by the gym doors, and he told me quietly that he'd lost 3 really talented athletes over the years because of language violations. One kid who was recruited by college scouts said something in Spanish during practice and got suspended, losing his eligibility and his scholarship offers. Another student who could have gone to state championships hummed a song in Vietnamese in the locker room and lost his spot on the team entirely. Coach Manley's voice was frustrated as he described watching these kids' futures disappear over words. He told me several other teachers had complained privately about the policy, but everyone was scared of retaliation if they spoke up publicly. His words confirmed what I'd suspected, that there were people who disagreed with Tiger but fear kept them silent. I thanked him for telling me, and he squeezed my shoulder before heading to his car. That night I couldn't sleep, my mind running through everything that could go wrong at the hearing. At 2 a.m., I jolted awake with my heart racing so fast it hurt. My chest felt tight like someone was sitting on it, and I couldn't catch my breath properly. The panic attack hit me full force, making my whole body shake while I tried to breathe slowly. I sat up in bed and grabbed my journal from the nightstand, turning on the lamp with trembling hands. Writing helped sometimes when my brain was spinning out of control. I started putting words on paper, all my fears about losing my future and my family struggling and being isolated at the school. I wrote about being angry that I had to fight this hard just to exist in both my languages. The words poured out messy and raw until my breathing finally started to slow down. By the time I filled 4 pages, my heart rate was almost normal, and the tight feeling in my chest had eased. I closed the journal and turned off the light, lying back down with the knowledge that I had 5 days until the hearing, and I just had to survive until then. Tuesday morning, I checked my email before school and found a message from someone named Jocelyn Park with a school board email address. The subject line said, "Concerned District Community Member," and my stomach flipped as I opened it. She wrote carefully, saying she was concerned about district policies that might not align with state and federal guidelines. She mentioned she'd been following my situation and suggested an off-the-record conversation if I was interested. Her email gave a personal cell number and said she had some afternoon availability this week. I forwarded the message to Mallory immediately and got a response during second period. Mallory's text said to be cautiously optimistic, that having a board member's attention was significant, but we shouldn't expect miracles from someone still dealing with politics. She told me to set up a meeting but to let her know when and where so she could advise me on what to say. I texted Jocelyn's number during lunch asking if Wednesday afternoon would work, and she responded within minutes with the name of a coffee shop off school grounds. Wednesday after school, I drove to the coffee shop and found Jocelyn already sitting at a back corner table with 2 cups of coffee in front of her. She was an Asian woman probably in her 40s wearing business casual clothes and looking tired. I sat down across from her and she pushed one of the coffees toward me before starting to talk in quiet, frustrated tones. She explained that she and other board members had received complaints about Tiger's English-only enforcement for years, going back to when the policy first started. Every time someone tried to address it, Board Chair Dirk Maddox and the district council shut down the conversation, worried about litigation and political backlash. Jocelyn described layers of bureaucracy and political calculation that protected bad policies even when people knew they were wrong. She was sympathetic but realistic about the institutional resistance we were fighting against. Then she leaned forward and told me she was planning to raise the issue at the next board meeting in 2 weeks, and she wanted to know if I'd be willing to provide public testimony. The idea of speaking in front of the whole board terrified me, but also felt empowering, like maybe I could actually make people listen. I told her yes, and she nodded, writing down some notes about timing and format. She warned me that Dirk would try to shut down the discussion, and that some board members would defend Tiger, but she promised to fight for a full hearing of the issues. We talked for another 20 minutes about the legal complaint Mallory had filed and the evidence we were gathering. When I left the coffee shop, I felt like I had an actual ally inside the system, rather than just fighting from the outside. Thursday morning, I opened my locker before first period and noticed something white sticking through the vent slots. I pulled out a folded piece of paper with careful block letters written in black pen. The note said, "Check bounty database on storage server. Records who got paid for what reports." My heart started pounding because I knew this had to be from Hao, the tech kid who reviewed audio footage for Tiger. He was offering me evidence of the payment system, proof that Tiger paid students to turn each other in. I looked around the hallway but didn't see anyone watching me. My first instinct was to try to access the server myself, but Mallory's voice in my head reminded me we had to do everything legally. I took a photo of the note and texted it to Mallory with an explanation of who I thought sent it. Then I tucked the note into my backpack and went to class, trying not to think about what information might be sitting on that server. By midday, Mallory responded with a firm text saying, "We absolutely could not access school servers illegally under any circumstances." She explained she was filing an official records request for all documentation of the student safety reporting program, including payment records. Her message said the anonymous tip gave us grounds to request specific information, turning Hao's hint into a legal discovery tool. I felt frustrated that we couldn't just grab the evidence right away, but I trusted Mallory knew what she was doing. The waiting was hard, though, knowing proof existed but having to go through proper channels to get it. Friday afternoon during last period, my phone buzzed with an email from Mallory. The district had responded to her records request with a bureaucratic denial, claiming the information was part of ongoing personnel matters and protected under privacy exemptions. Mallory's follow-up text said she'd expected this response and was immediately filing an appeal. She explained this was now a chess game where every move and counter-move mattered, that the district was trying to run out the clock and we had to stay patient. The frustration of being blocked felt overwhelming because I knew that database existed and proved everything, but they were hiding behind legal excuses. I reminded myself that Mallory had warned me legal battles required patience and strategy rather than immediate confrontation. Monday morning, I got to the school early and went straight to my locker to drop off my jacket. 2 administrators I'd never spoken to before appeared on either side of me, telling me I'd been selected for a random locker search. I looked around the hallway and saw no other students being searched, just me with 2 adults watching my every move. They made me step back while they went through my backpack and locker, pulling out books and papers and looking inside every pocket. My hands were shaking as I texted Mallory under my bag, just typing, "Locker search happening now." One administrator was taking photos of my belongings while the other one asked questions about why I had so many folders and what was in my notebooks. They found nothing because I'd been incredibly careful not to bring anything that could be used against me. Within 3 minutes, my phone rang with Mallory's number and I answered it right there in the hallway. She asked to speak to one of the administrators and I handed my phone over, watching his face change as Mallory spoke. He handed the phone back to me after 30 seconds, and both administrators started putting my stuff back in my locker quickly. Mallory's voice on the phone was calm but firm, telling me she'd just informed the vice principal that this constituted harassment and retaliation that would be documented in our complaint. After the administrators walked away, I leaned against my locker feeling shaky, but also strangely powerful. They'd tried to intimidate me into backing down, but Mallory had shut it down in minutes. The message was clear, though. They weren't going to stop coming after me until this was resolved one way or another. At lunch, I headed to the library instead of the cafeteria, because I needed quiet space away from the staring and whispers that had followed me all morning. I was sitting at a back table pretending to read my history textbook when someone pulled out the chair across from me carefully, like they were approaching a wild animal. Elora Lamb sat down with her notebook and a nervous smile, introducing herself as the school newspaper editor working on an article about the English-only policy. She explained she wanted to include my story, but could keep me anonymous if I wanted, and I felt my stomach twist, because part of me wanted to hide forever, while another part wanted everyone to know what Tiger was doing. I told her I needed to check with Mallory first, and she nodded like she expected that, sliding her phone number across the table and saying she'd done research on language discrimination cases and student rights law. Her questions were smart and informed when I called her back an hour later after getting Mallory's careful approval for an anonymous interview. She asked about the surveillance system, the bounty payments, how the policy affected my daily life and my family, taking notes in neat handwriting while I talked. I found myself describing things I hadn't told anyone, like hiding in the janitor's closet to take grandma's calls, or pretending not to understand Chinese when other kids tested me. Elora listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she thanked me seriously, promising the article would be factual and fair, that she wasn't trying to make this about drama, but about showing the real impact of the policy. Wednesday morning, I was walking into school when I saw students crowded around the newspaper stands, pulling out copies and reading with their phones out, taking pictures. Elora's article was the front page with the headline, "The Cost of English Only: How One Policy Affects Entire Communities," in bold letters that made my heart race. I grabbed a copy and stood in the hallway reading while students pushed past me, the article laying out everything in careful detail. She'd documented the bounty system with quotes from anonymous students about getting paid $50 per report, included excerpts from the staff memo Fletcher had given me, described multiple cases of suspensions and lost opportunities. My story was in there anonymously as a junior who faced expulsion for translating medical information during a family emergency, and seeing it in print made it feel both more real and more terrifying. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The article was devastating in its calm, factual tone, explaining how Tiger's enforcement had created a culture where students feared speaking their home languages even in emergencies. I watched kids reading on their phones and passing copies to friends, some nodding seriously while others looked uncomfortable or defensive. By second period, the article had been shared on social media, and students from other schools were commenting, the story spreading beyond our building in ways I hadn't expected. I felt exposed, like everyone could see through the anonymous description to know it was me, but also vindicated because finally someone was documenting what had been happening for years. That afternoon, the intercom crackled during fourth period, announcing an emergency assembly in the auditorium, everyone required to attend immediately. We filed in confused while teachers lined the walls looking tense, and Tiger stood on stage with his arms crossed, waiting for silence. When he started speaking, his voice was tight and angry, insisting that maintaining English-only spaces was essential for school safety and national security. He said students who couldn't respect basic rules about language were free to attend schools elsewhere, that this policy protected everyone from cheating and ensured fair education. His face got redder as he talked, and I sat in the middle section watching him perform authority, while my anger hardened into something cold and determined. He claimed the newspaper article was full of lies and exaggerations from students trying to avoid consequences for breaking clear rules, that anonymous sources couldn't be trusted. Then something unexpected happened when a girl 2 rows ahead of me stood up and walked toward the exit, not running or making a scene, just calmly leaving. 3 more students followed her, then 5 more, a quiet stream of people refusing to stay and listen. Tiger's voice got louder, trying to talk over the movement, but more students kept standing and walking out, maybe 20 total by the time he stopped speaking. I stayed in my seat because Mallory had warned me about giving them any excuse for more discipline, but I watched those students leave and felt something shift in the building's atmosphere. The resistance that would have been unthinkable a week ago was happening right in front of Tiger, and his aggressive defense felt desperate rather than powerful. Thursday. I took the morning off school to go with Grandma to her cardiology follow-up appointment at the hospital. The receptionist handed us a form asking what language we preferred, and within 5 minutes a professional interpreter arrived, a woman in business clothes with an official badge. I sat in the exam room watching how the doctor spoke directly to Grandma, while the interpreter translated, making eye contact with her instead of with me or the interpreter. The doctor explained test results carefully through the interpreter, asking Grandma if she understood, and answering her questions with patience. Everything was set up, so Grandma could participate fully in her own healthcare. The interpreter's presence treated as completely normal and necessary, rather than a special favor. I took notes on my phone about how they did it, the professional standards and the hospital's language access policies posted on the wall in multiple languages. The contrast with my school's approach was so stark it made me angry all over again, seeing how other institutions treated language access as a basic right. After the appointment, I asked the interpreter about her training, and she explained the certification process, the legal requirements for medical interpretation, how lives depend on clear communication. She seemed genuinely shocked when I described the school's English-only policy, saying she couldn't imagine punishing emergency translation, when that's exactly when language access matters most. Friday afternoon, I was in the library working on homework when my phone buzzed with a text from Jocelyn saying to check the school board's website. Board Chair Dirk had released a statement saying the board would review language accommodation policies to ensure they meet contemporary educational standards, which sounded promising until I kept reading. The statement was full of vague language about careful consideration and thorough review processes. Nothing concrete about actually changing the policy or investigating Tiger's enforcement. I texted Jocelyn asking if this was good news, and she called me instead of texting back, her voice frustrated as she explained it was political maneuvering. She said Dirk was trying to appear responsive to the newspaper article and community concern while doing nothing real, just running out the clock until attention moved elsewhere. He was protecting Tiger and the district from liability, while making it look like they cared about the issue. My impatience with these bureaucratic delays felt overwhelming, because kids were still being monitored and reported every day. But Jocelyn reminded me that public pressure was building even if the board was moving slowly. She said the newspaper article had generated more community response than she'd seen on any issue in years, that parents and advocacy groups were starting to pay attention. Mallory texted me later that evening with similar analysis, saying institutional change takes time, but we were making progress by forcing them to publicly acknowledge the issue. Over the weekend, I got a Facebook message from someone I barely knew, just a profile picture of a guy from the school I'd seen in hallways. Howe introduced himself as the tech student who'd monitored audio footage for Tiger, and my first reaction was anger because he'd been part of the surveillance system. But his message was nervous and apologetic, explaining he had backup files of the bounty database from before Tiger ordered him to delete everything last week. He wrote that he'd been feeling terrible about his role in the system ever since he learned what my emergency call was actually about, that he wanted to help, but was scared of getting expelled himself. He asked if there was a way to share the information without destroying his own future, his message clearly showing he was wrestling with guilt and fear. I sat staring at my phone for 10 minutes trying to decide how to respond, because this could be huge evidence, but I didn't know if I could trust him. Eventually, I texted Mallory asking what to do, and she called me immediately, her voice excited but careful. She told me to respond to Howe, saying I appreciated him reaching out, and to ask if he'd be willing to talk to my attorney about protections for sharing evidence. I sent the message feeling protective of this unexpected ally who was risking everything to expose the truth, hoping Mallory could help him do the right thing safely. By Monday, Mallory had connected Howe with a separate attorney who specialized in student rights and whistleblower cases, making sure he had independent legal advice before deciding anything. She explained to me that Howe needed his own lawyer to protect his interests separate from mine, that we couldn't pressure him or make promises about what would happen. That afternoon, she called to say Howe had agreed to provide his evidence after securing legal protections, and she was drafting his affidavit with the other attorney. The affidavit detailed exactly how the bounty system worked, with Tiger paying students $50 per verified language violation report through a database that tracked reporter names and payment amounts. Howe had screenshots of the payment records showing dozens of reports over 2 years, proving this wasn't just occasional enforcement but systematic surveillance with financial incentives. The most damaging part was evidence that Tiger had ordered all records deleted when my case started getting legal attention, which showed consciousness of guilt. Mallory's voice on the phone was intense when she explained how explosive this evidence was, proving not just the English-only policy, but active financial incentives for student informants and attempted destruction of evidence. She said this transformed the case from policy disagreement to documented systematic abuse, the kind of evidence that would be very hard for the district to explain away. Tuesday brought another breakthrough when Mallory called saying her legal research had uncovered something significant about the audio surveillance system. She'd been digging into state laws about recording conversations and found that the cameras with audio recording likely violated consent laws requiring two-party notification. She explained that you can't legally record people's conversations without telling them in most situations, and while schools have some exceptions for security, recording private conversations in hallways probably crossed the line. She was filing a supplemental complaint arguing the English-only policy was discriminatory and the enforcement mechanism itself was illegal. The discovery added a criminal dimension to what was already a civil rights case, meaning Tiger and the district might face legal consequences beyond just changing the policy. I felt the pressure increasing from multiple directions now, not just my individual case, but systematic problems with how they'd been operating for years. Mallory warned me that this would make them more defensive and possibly more aggressive in retaliation, but it also significantly increased pressure on the district to negotiate rather than fight. Wednesday afternoon, Mallory texted me that the district's council had reached out requesting a meeting to discuss resolution options, which she interpreted as them realizing their legal position was weak. She explained that institutions don't ask for settlement discussions unless they're worried about losing in court, that this was a sign our evidence and legal arguments were having impact. She scheduled the meeting for Friday but warned me not to expect immediate victory, saying institutions protect themselves first, and justice comes second if at all. They'd want to resolve this quietly with minimum admission of wrongdoing, probably offering to drop my discipline in exchange for me staying quiet about the larger issues. I felt cautiously hopeful because at least they were willing to talk after weeks of stonewalling, but Mallory's warnings kept my expectations realistic. She said we'd go into the meeting with clear demands, including policy changes, not just fixing my individual situation, and we'd see how serious they were about real reform. Thursday morning, I got called to the debate coach's office during second period, confused because we didn't have practice scheduled. The faculty advisor sat behind his desk looking uncomfortable and told me I was removed from the team effective immediately due to my ongoing disciplinary issues, making me ineligible to represent the school. I felt my stomach drop because I'd been working toward a debate scholarship for 3 years, one of my main hopes for college funding after losing other opportunities. I asked what specific rule made me ineligible, and he wouldn't give me a straight answer, just kept saying it was an administrative decision based on my disciplinary record. The timing was so obviously coordinated to pressure me before Friday's meeting with the district. One more way to show me what I was losing by fighting back. I walked out of his office and went straight to my car in the parking lot, sitting there crying for 20 minutes before I could pull myself together enough to drive to Mallory's office. She took one look at my face and pulled me into the conference room, listening while I explained what happened, and then getting angry in a way I hadn't seen from her before. She said this was blatant retaliation, and we were adding it to our complaint immediately, that they were making our case stronger every time they came after me. But her anger didn't change the fact that my debate scholarship was gone, that they'd successfully destroyed another piece of my college prospects. I broke down crying again in her office while she documented everything, feeling the weight of all these attacks and wondering how much more I could lose before this was over. I drove home in a fog, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tight while my mind kept replaying the faculty advisor's uncomfortable face as he destroyed 3 years of my work with one administrative decision. Mom's car was already in the driveway when I pulled up, which meant she'd left work early again, probably after I'd texted her about the debate team. I found her at the kitchen table with her work uniform still on, staring at her phone like she was trying to figure out what to say to me. She looked up when I walked in, and her face did this thing where she tried to smile but couldn't quite make it work, and suddenly I was crying again, even though I thought I'd used up all my tears in Mallory's office. She pulled me into a hug without saying anything, just held me while I sobbed into her shoulder, and when I finally pulled away, she had tears on her face too. We sat down at the table and she started talking in Chinese, her voice quiet and careful, telling me things she'd never shared before about her first year as a prison guard. She described how the other guards used to switch to rapid English whenever she approached, how they'd laugh at her accent when she tried to join conversations, how her supervisor told her she needed to speak more American if she wanted to be taken seriously. She explained that she learned to stay silent, to never speak Chinese even during breaks, to make herself small and invisible so they'd stop seeing her as different. Her strategy was survival through silence, becoming so quiet and compliant that they'd forget to target her, and it worked well enough that she kept her job, and eventually they mostly left her alone. I listened to her describe 20 years of swallowing her voice at work, of accepting disrespect as the price of stability, of choosing our family's financial security over her own dignity every single day. Then she looked at me with this expression that was equal parts fear and frustration, and said she understood why I was fighting, but she was scared of what it would cost us. We started arguing, her voice getting louder as she talked about our mortgage and my college fund, and what happens if she loses her job because I'm making waves in the community. I pushed back hard, saying that Grandma almost died and staying quiet means accepting that her life was worth less than Tiger's rules, that some things matter more than being safe. She stood up and paced around the kitchen, her hands shaking as she tried to explain that I didn't understand how hard it was to rebuild after you lose everything, how our family had already sacrificed so much just to get to this point. I stayed in my chair, feeling my own hands shake with anger and hurt, wanting her to see that her survival strategy was exactly what people like Tiger counted on, that silence just gave them permission to keep destroying people. We went back and forth like this for almost an hour, both of us crying and yelling and saying things we probably shouldn't have said, until finally we were both too exhausted to keep fighting. Mom sat back down and reached across the table to take my hand, her grip tight and desperate, and told me she was proud of me even though she was scared. She said her generation survived by staying quiet, but maybe that wasn't enough anymore, that maybe I needed to fight this differently than she ever could. I squeezed her hand back and told her I understood why she chose silence, that her choices kept us fed and housed and safe, but I couldn't do it her way. We sat there holding hands across the table, both understanding that we were talking about two different kinds of strength, both valid but leading to completely different choices. Eventually she nodded and said she'd support me even though it scared her, that she'd be there at the board meeting and anywhere else I needed her. That night I barely slept, my mind racing through everything that could still go wrong, but knowing Mom was with me made the fear feel slightly more manageable. Friday morning I woke up to 17 text messages in a group chat I'd been added to overnight. Elora had started the thread, and it was full of students I barely knew, all talking about a sit-in protest they were planning for Monday morning. The messages explained that they were demanding the English-only policy get suspended immediately and my expulsion hearing get canceled, that they'd gather in the main hallway during first period and stay there until administration agreed to talk. Someone had already made signs in about 12 different languages, and another person was coordinating with local media to make sure cameras would be there. I stared at my phone feeling this weird mix of grateful and scared, realizing that my private legal battle was turning into a public demonstration, whether I was ready for it or not. Elora sent me a direct message asking if I wanted to be there, but saying I didn't have to participate if it felt like too much, that they were doing this because the policy was wrong regardless of my personal situation. I screenshot the messages and sent them to Mallory, asking what she thought about me being visible at a student protest. She called me back within 10 minutes, and we talked through the risks and benefits, her voice measured and careful as she explained that showing up could be powerful, but also might give Tiger ammunition to claim I was organizing disruption. We went back and forth for a while before she finally said the decision was mine, but that students had a right to peaceful protest, and my presence there would send a clear message about standing up for what's right. I spent the rest of Friday thinking about it, weighing my fear of being the center of attention against my need to stop hiding. By Saturday evening, I'd made up my mind and texted Elora that I'd be there Monday morning, my stomach twisting into knots as I hit send, but feeling like I was finally moving from victim to participant in my own defense. Monday morning, I got to the school 20 minutes before first period and found about 40 students already sitting in the main hallway with their signs and backpacks. Elora saw me arrive and waved me over, her face lighting up with this huge smile that made me feel slightly less scared about what we were doing. The signs were beautiful and defiant, covered in phrases like, "My language is not a crime," and "Speak your truth," written in Spanish and Vietnamese and Korean, and about 8 other languages I didn't recognize. Students sat cross-legged on the floor in neat rows, talking quietly to each other and checking their phones, the whole scene feeling organized and purposeful rather than chaotic. The bell rang for first period and none of us moved, just stayed sitting there while other students walked past looking confused or supportive or angry depending on who they were. About 10 minutes into first period, Tiger came storming down the hallway with 2 security guards flanking him, his face already red and his jaw clenched tight. He stopped at the edge of our group and started yelling about how we were all getting immediate suspension for disrupting school operations and violating about 15 different conduct codes. The students around me didn't move or respond, just sat there looking up at him calmly while he got louder and more aggressive. Then Mallory appeared from somewhere behind us, walking up to stand between Tiger and the sitting students, her voice cool and professional as she informed him that students had a constitutional right to peaceful protest and that he was recorded by multiple devices. Tiger's face went from red to purple, and he pulled out his phone to call the police, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear about how he needed officers to remove trespassing protesters from the school property. We all sat there waiting while he made his call, the tension thick enough to taste, students holding hands and staying completely silent. 2 police officers showed up about 15 minutes later and walked slowly through the hallway, looking at all of us sitting there with our signs. Tiger started explaining to them about disruption and trespassing and demanding they arrest people, but the officers just looked uncomfortable and kept glancing at each other. One of them finally told Tiger that these appeared to be peaceful student protesters exercising free speech rights and that he wasn't going to arrest kids for sitting quietly in their own school. Tiger started arguing with the officer, his voice getting shrill and desperate, but the cop just shook his head and said this was a school administration issue, not a police matter. The officers left and Tiger stood there looking like he might explode, his authority completely undermined in front of 40 students and my attorney who was documenting everything on her phone. By afternoon, news vans started pulling into the school parking lot after Elora had sent them information about the protest. Cameras set up in the hallway while reporters interviewed students about why they were sitting in, and I watched Tiger try to control the narrative by giving his own interview near the main office. The footage on the evening news was devastating for him because the visual contrast was so powerful. There he was, red-faced and aggressive, towering over sitting students and yelling about rules and respect, while a diverse group of calm young people explained clearly and thoughtfully why the English-only policy harmed them and their families. A Vietnamese girl talked about how the policy made her feel ashamed of her parents. A Korean boy described hiding his language like it was something dirty. A Haitian student explained how she got suspended for humming a song her grandmother taught her. The reporters ate it up, asking pointed questions about whether the policy targeted specific communities and whether emergency situations like mine should result in expulsion. Tiger kept trying to redirect to the school's safety and American values, but every time he opened his mouth, he sounded more defensive and authoritarian. I watched the coverage that evening from my couch with Mom and Grandma, seeing our story transform from a private legal battle into a public conversation about language rights and discrimination in schools. The local news ran it as their lead story, and by the time the broadcast ended, my phone was blowing up with messages from people I hadn't talked to in years, some supportive and some calling me a troublemaker who was destroying the school. The story had escaped the building and become something bigger than just my case, part of a larger conversation about how schools treat multilingual students and whether policies like Tiger's were legal or ethical. I felt exposed and vindicated at the same time, scared of the attention, but hopeful that maybe this visibility would force real change. Tuesday morning brought an email from the school district announcing an emergency board meeting scheduled for Thursday evening with an open public comment period. Jocelyn texted me within an hour of the announcement, her message short but clear about this being our opportunity to present our case directly to decision-makers in a forum where they couldn't ignore us. She explained that the media coverage had created enough pressure that the board had to respond publicly, that they were worried about the story spreading and making the district look bad. Mallory called me during lunch to discuss strategy for the meeting, her voice excited but controlled as she talked about preparing testimony and organizing our evidence presentation. The prospect of speaking publicly at a board meeting scared me more than anything else so far, because it meant standing up in front of cameras and community members and district officials to tell my story out loud. I spent Tuesday afternoon feeling sick to my stomach every time I thought about Thursday, my hands getting sweaty and my heart racing whenever I pictured myself at that microphone. But Mallory spent an hour on the phone with me explaining why this was probably our best chance to force real change, that board meetings created public records and official responses that we could use later if needed. She helped me understand that my testimony would be part of a larger strategy, that other people would speak too, and together we'd build a case that was impossible to ignore. By Tuesday evening, I'd committed to doing it even though the fear hadn't gone away. Just got pushed down under a layer of determination to see this through. I spent Wednesday and Thursday preparing my testimony with Mallory on video calls, writing and rewriting my statement until it was clear and factual and honest without being angry or accusatory. She coached me on how to present evidence effectively, how to speak clearly into the microphone, how to stay calm if board members asked hostile questions. We practiced over and over until I could get through the whole thing without my voice shaking too badly, though my hands still trembled when I held the printed pages. Thursday morning, Peters found me in the hallway before first period and handed me a sealed envelope, his face carefully neutral as he told me several teachers had written a character reference letter supporting my academic record. I opened it in my car during lunch and found 3 pages of detailed testimony from teachers describing my work ethic, my contributions to class discussions, and the fear-based environment Tiger had created that affected their ability to teach effectively. The letter was signed by 7 teachers, including Peters, and reading it made me cry because I'd felt so alone in this fight. But here was proof that adults in the building had been paying attention and were willing to risk something to support me. By Thursday afternoon, I was as ready as I'd ever be, my printed statement in a folder along with the teacher letter and copies of all our evidence. Mom got home from work early and changed out of her uniform, and Grandma insisted on coming even though we were worried about her being out late. The 3 of us drove to the district office together, Mom holding my hand in the car while Grandma sat in the back seat telling me in Chinese that I was brave and she was proud. The board meeting room was already packed when we arrived at 6:30 for the 7 o'clock start, every seat filled with community members and students and parents and local media with cameras. I recognized faces from the school mixed in with people I'd never seen before, some holding supportive signs and others looking angry about the attention this issue was getting. Mallory met us at the door and walked us to seats she'd saved in the 3rd row, close enough to see everything but not so close that I'd feel exposed. The board members filed in at 7 and took their seats at the long table at the front, and I watched them shuffle papers and whisper to each other while the room slowly quieted down. The board chair opened the meeting with standard procedural stuff, and then announced that they'd hear public comment for up to 2 hours, with a 3-minute limit per speaker. A Haitian parent was first, standing at the microphone with shaking hands to describe how her daughter got suspended for humming in the hallway, how the girl stopped singing completely after that and became quiet and withdrawn. A Vietnamese student spoke next, his voice steady as he explained how the policy forced him to hide his identity and pretend his language and culture didn't exist for 8 hours a day. A Korean mother went third, her English heavily accented as she described trying to communicate with teachers about her son's learning needs and being told she couldn't speak Korean on the school property, even in private parent-teacher conferences. Person after person came to the microphone with stories of harm and discrimination, each testimony adding another piece to a devastating picture of systematic abuse disguised as educational policy. I sat there listening to all these experiences that mirrored my own, realizing I was part of a much larger community of people who'd been damaged by Tiger's rules. When my turn came, I walked to the microphone on shaking legs and read my statement about Grandma's emergency, about choosing between a life and a rule, about how the policy created impossible situations where doing the right thing meant destroying your future. My voice only broke once near the end, and when I finished and walked back to my seat, several people in the audience were crying, and Mom grabbed my hand so tight it hurt. After public comment ended around 9, the board announced they were going into closed session to review evidence with district council. Mallory gathered up her briefcase and followed them into the back room, carrying Howe's affidavit and the backup database files that proved the bounty system. The rest of us were left sitting in the hallway outside the meeting room, waiting and wondering what was happening behind those closed doors. 2 hours crawled by while we sat on uncomfortable benches, some people leaving because it was getting late, but most staying because they wanted to hear the outcome. Jocelyn came out briefly around 10:30 and walked past us, catching my eye and giving a tiny nod before disappearing into the bathroom. She came back a minute later and walked slowly past us again, and this time she whispered without stopping or looking at us that the evidence was making an impact, and several board members looked troubled by what they were seeing. I felt hope flare up in my chest for the first time all evening, thinking maybe all this fighting and sacrifice might actually lead somewhere. Mom dozed off on my shoulder while we waited, exhausted from her work shift and the emotional weight of the evening, and I sat there watching the clock tick past 11 and then 11:30, wondering if they'd make us wait all night. When the board finally reconvened in open session at 9 minutes past midnight, everyone still in the building crowded back into the meeting room. The board chair looked tired and uncomfortable as he read from a prepared statement, his voice flat and official as he announced that Principal Tiger was placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. He continued reading that the English-only policy was suspended effective immediately, and that my expulsion hearing was postponed indefinitely pending a comprehensive policy review. The relief that hit me was so overwhelming I actually felt dizzy, my vision going spotty around the edges while my heart pounded in my chest. Mom grabbed my hand and squeezed so hard I thought she might break my fingers, and around us the room erupted into applause, mixed with some angry shouts from people who supported Tiger's policy. The board chair kept reading through the noise, explaining that the district would be conducting a thorough review of language access policies and student rights, that they took these concerns seriously, and were committed to ensuring all students felt safe and supported. It wasn't complete victory because Tiger wasn't fired and the policy wasn't eliminated permanently, but it was real progress that seemed impossible just a few weeks ago when I was sitting in Mallory's office crying about losing everything. We filed out of the building after midnight, Mom and Grandma and me walking to the car in silence because we were all too exhausted and relieved to find words. I sat in the back seat on the drive home, watching streetlights pass by the window and feeling like maybe I could breathe again for the first time since that day in the hallway when I chose to save Grandma's life. The following Monday, I walked into school under a new interim principal, a calm woman named Dr. Chang, who'd sent a school-wide email Sunday evening clarifying that students could speak any language and that discrimination or harassment based on language would not be tolerated. The climate in the building was tentative and strange, with some students coming up to hug me or thank me in hallways, while others glared and whispered as I passed. I could feel the division in the school. People who saw me as someone who'd stood up for what was right, versus people who thought I'd destroyed a principal who was just trying to maintain order. Teachers seemed uncertain about how to act, some going out of their way to be supportive, while others avoided eye contact and hurried past like they didn't want to be associated with the controversy. I kept my head down and focused on catching up on schoolwork I'd missed during the crisis, sitting in classes and taking notes and trying to pretend everything was normal, even though nothing felt normal at all. At lunch, I sat with Hao and Alora and a few other students who'd been part of the sit-in, and we talked quietly about how weird it felt to be back in this building after everything that had happened. But underneath the weirdness and tension, I could breathe in a way I hadn't been able to for 3 years. I could answer my phone if Grandma called without fear of destroying my life. I could speak Chinese if I needed to without checking over my shoulder for hall monitors with notebooks. The surveillance cameras were still there, but they didn't feel like weapons anymore. Just normal school security that existed in every building. I walked through hallways where I used to feel hunted, and now just felt like a regular student trying to get to class on time, and that shift alone felt like victory, even though I knew the fight wasn't completely over. 2 weeks passed with me going through the motions of normal student life, attending classes and doing homework and trying to pretend the weight of potential expulsion wasn't still hanging over everything I did. Then I got called to the main office where a secretary told me district administration wanted to meet with me and my parent that afternoon at 3. Mom left work early again, and we drove to the district building in silence, both of us tense, because we had no idea if this was good news or just another way they were going to try to pressure me into accepting punishment I didn't deserve. The conference room had 4 district people sitting on one side of a long table, and Mallory was already there on our side, her briefcase open and legal pad covered in notes. The superintendent started talking in this careful voice about how they'd reviewed my case thoroughly and wanted to propose a resolution that acknowledged the emergency circumstances while also maintaining procedural standards. What that actually meant was they'd admit I was justified in speaking Chinese to save Grandma's life, and they'd remove the expulsion threat completely, but they wanted me to accept a 1-day suspension for leaving class without permission. Mallory leaned over and whispered that this was the face-saving compromise she'd expected, that they couldn't fully admit fault without opening themselves to liability. But this deal got me what I actually needed. I felt anger rise in my throat because they still couldn't just say they were wrong, couldn't apologize for nearly destroying my future over a rule that should never have existed. The superintendent kept talking about how the suspension would be scheduled on a teacher planning day, so I wouldn't miss any instruction, and in exchange, all disciplinary records related to the expulsion proceedings would be completely erased from my file. They also wanted me to participate in developing a new district language access policy, and some kind of program they were calling restorative justice. Mom squeezed my hand under the table, and I looked at Mallory, who gave me a tiny nod that said, this was as good as we were going to get through negotiation. I understood the political reality even though I hated it, that institutions protect themselves first, and admitting complete wrongdoing wasn't something they were capable of doing. The meeting ended with them saying we could take time to think about it, and they'd need an answer by the end of the week. That evening, Mom and Grandma and I sat at our kitchen table going over everything Mallory had explained about the compromise terms. The 1-day suspension felt like a slap after everything I'd been through, this symbolic punishment for saving my grandmother's life that let them pretend they'd maintained some kind of authority. But Mallory had been clear on the phone that fighting for complete vindication would mean months more of legal proceedings with no guarantee of a better outcome, and the compromise protected what mattered most, which was my college prospects and my clean record going forward. Grandma kept saying in Chinese that she was sorry I had to accept any punishment at all, that it wasn't right, and I had to keep reassuring her that I'd make the same choice again no matter what it cost. Mom was practical about it, pointing out that missing one planning day was nothing compared to expulsion, and the policy development work might actually let me turn this nightmare into something useful. We called Mallory back the next morning and told her we'd accept the terms. She scheduled a meeting with the district for Friday to finalize everything and make it official. Friday afternoon, I sat in the interim principal's office with Mom while Dr. Chang walked us through the agreement page by page, explaining each section in this calm, professional voice that was so different from Tiger's aggressive threats. The document said the district acknowledged that emergency circumstances had required immediate communication in my native language to prevent serious harm, and that my actions had been necessary and appropriate under the specific situation. It said the one-day suspension for leaving class without permission would be served on the next teacher planning day, and would be the only disciplinary record maintained, with all references to expulsion or language policy violations removed from my permanent file. The final section outlined my commitment to working with a district committee to develop language access educational materials and participate in restorative justice programming. I read every word twice before signing my name at the bottom, and Mom signed as my parent and doctor. Chang signed as the school representative. Walking out of that office, I felt something shift inside me like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. The fear that had been choking me for weeks, the constant terror that my future was destroyed, finally started to ease. I wasn't completely free because the fight for real policy change was still ongoing, but my personal case was resolved enough that I could breathe and plan for college without that expulsion threat hanging over everything. The next month turned into a strange kind of productive distraction as I joined the district committee working on language access materials. Mr. Peters was on the committee representing teachers, and Alora volunteered as a student representative along with me, and there were a couple of administrators and a person from the district's diversity office. We met twice a week after school in a conference room at the district building, working through what a language access workshop should actually teach, and how to make it something more than just checking a box. I pushed for including real stories from students about how the English-only policy had hurt them, and Mr. Peters backed me up by sharing examples of talented kids he'd seen pushed out of school over language violations. Alora researched other districts that had multilingual policies, and found examples of schools that celebrated linguistic diversity instead of punishing it. By mid-October, we had a draft curriculum for a 2-hour workshop that covered the educational benefits of multilingualism, legal requirements around language access, and practical protocols for emergency situations. The district scheduled a pilot workshop for early November with volunteer staff from 3 schools, and I helped present the section on student experiences, even though standing in front of teachers and talking about what had happened to me made my hands shake. The feedback was mostly positive, with several teachers saying they'd never thought about how the surveillance system had created fear, and the district committed to rolling out the workshop to all schools starting next semester. Grandma's birthday came in early November, and we had a small party at our house with just family and a few neighbors, including the woman who'd called 911 that day. Mom cooked all of Grandma's favorite dishes, and we crowded around our little dining table, speaking Chinese freely and loudly. Nobody worried about who might hear or report us. The neighbor kept thanking me again for saving Grandma's life, describing in detail how scared she'd been when Grandma collapsed, and how grateful she was that I'd been able to translate for the paramedics. Grandma was doing well, her heart stable according to her last cardiology appointment, and watching her laugh with neighbors and eat too much food filled me with this deep gratitude that she was here. We'd come so close to losing her because of Tiger's insane policy, and sitting at that table surrounded by people speaking my language and celebrating someone I loved reminded me why I'd been willing to risk everything. The celebration was happy, but there was this awareness underneath everything, this knowledge of how fragile it all was, and how lucky we were that the emergency had happened when my phone was accessible, and I'd been able to run to make that call. Mid-November brought news that Mallory had filed a formal complaint with the Federal Office for Civil Rights, a detailed document that outlined the English-only policy's discriminatory impact on students and families, and requested a full investigation into district practices. She explained to me over the phone that this was about creating accountability beyond just my individual case, making sure the district couldn't quietly go back to old habits once media attention died down. The complaint included Howe's affidavit about the bounty system, copies of the staff memo directing teachers to report language violations, and testimony from multiple students and parents about how the policy had harmed them. Mallory said the investigation process would take months, but it was important long-term work to prevent this from happening to future students. I felt good about it, even though I knew I might not see the results. That this was the kind of slow institutional change work that mattered even when it wasn't dramatic or immediate. Around the same time, Jocelyn texted me asking if we could meet for coffee off the record, and when we sat down at the same shop as before, she looked tired and frustrated. She told me that Board Chair Dirk had been pressuring her and 2 other reform-minded board members to slow down the policy changes and minimize consequences for Tiger, arguing that moving too fast would create legal liability and make the district look bad. Some board members wanted to quietly let Tiger retire with full benefits and just move on without any real accountability for what he'd done. Jocelyn was refusing to back down, pushing for a full investigation and permanent policy changes with enforcement mechanisms, but she admitted the internal politics were messy and exhausting. She said some board members were genuinely committed to change, while others were just doing damage control for public relations, and figuring out who actually cared versus who was performing concern was hard. Her willingness to keep fighting despite the political pressure gave me hope that real change was possible, even if it was slower and more complicated than I wanted. Late November brought a new crisis when Hao's identity as the whistleblower leaked somehow, and suddenly everyone at the school knew he was the tech kid who'd turned over the bounty database. The hallway whispers started immediately, people calling him a snitch and a traitor, saying he'd only come forward to save himself after helping Tiger spy on everyone for years. His social media filled up with attacks from students who'd been caught by the surveillance system, blaming him for their suspensions even though he'd been a kid following orders from an authority figure. I saw him eating lunch alone in the library one day and went to sit with him, bringing my tray over to his table and saying loud enough for nearby students to hear that what he'd done took real courage. We started sitting together regularly after that, and I made a point of defending him when people talked trash, reminding them that he'd risked his own future to expose a system that was wrong. Hao and I formed this unlikely friendship based on both of us having stood up to Tiger's system and faced consequences for doing what was right. He told me about the guilt he'd carried for months while reviewing audio footage and reporting students, how he'd tried to ignore obvious violations sometimes, but Tiger had checked his work and threatened to report him for not being thorough enough. We talked about how hard it was to resist authority when you were young and scared and didn't see any way out, and how important it was that he'd finally found the courage to expose the truth, even though it cost him socially. The social cost of everything I'd done became clearer as November turned to December, and I realized some of my former friends were avoiding me. People I'd eaten lunch with for years suddenly had other plans or other tables to sit at, uncomfortable with the controversy around me or genuinely disagreeing with my choices. A girl I'd been friends with since freshman year told me at her locker one day that she thought I'd been selfish to speak Chinese knowing the rules, that I should have found another way that didn't put the whole school under media scrutiny. Another friend stopped responding to my texts after her parents told her to stay away from the situation because they didn't want her getting involved in anything that might affect her college applications. I spent a weekend feeling completely isolated and questioning whether fighting back had been worth losing relationships that had mattered to me. But eventually, I accepted that some people would never understand why I'd made the choices I made, and their inability to see the injustice wasn't my responsibility to fix. My circle was smaller now, but it felt more real, made up of people like Hao and Alora, and a few others who'd actually supported me through the crisis, instead of disappearing when things got hard. Early December meant college application deadlines were approaching, and I needed to figure out how to address the disciplinary incident that was still technically on my record, even though the expulsion had been dropped. I met with my college counselor in her office after school, bringing printed copies of the agreement and Mallory's legal summary of what had happened. The counselor read through everything carefully, and then helped me think about how to frame my personal essay. Instead of trying to explain away the suspension or make excuses, she suggested I write about caregiving responsibilities, language access advocacy, and what it means to stand up for family values even when institutions try to punish you for it. The essay became about finding my voice after years of forced silence, about choosing to fight for what's right even when the cost is high, about learning that integrity sometimes means accepting consequences rather than compromising your principles. I wrote draft after draft, trying to capture the complexity of the situation without sounding bitter or angry, trying to show growth and leadership rather than just victimhood. Several teachers offered to write recommendation letters emphasizing my integrity and character through adversity, including Mr. Peters, who wrote about my courage in standing up to unjust policies and my commitment to creating positive change through the policy development work. By mid-December, I had my applications ready to submit, and while I knew the suspension might hurt my chances at some schools, I felt like the essay was honest and strong and represented who I'd become through this experience. The district's email arrived 2 weeks before winter break, with a PDF attachment labeled Language Access Guidelines for Students and Families. I opened it during lunch and read through 5 pages of careful language about how students have the right to speak any language and how emergency situations need flexible communication. The guidelines talked about making sure families could communicate with the school and how staff should help students who need language support. But nowhere did they apologize for what had happened or say that what Tiger did was wrong. They just moved forward like they were starting fresh without admitting the past 3 years had been a disaster. I forwarded it to Mallory, and she called me that afternoon saying it was kind of a win, that getting official policy change on paper mattered even if it wasn't perfect. I felt weird about it, like I should be happy, but instead I was just mad that they couldn't admit they'd messed up. The validation of seeing my fight lead to actual policy felt real, but their refusal to say sorry or name Tiger's actions as discrimination left me frustrated and unsettled. In January, the district scheduled what they called a restorative justice circle at the community center, bringing together students who'd been hurt by the English-only policy, along with staff and administrators to talk about what happened and how to move forward. I walked into the meeting room on a cold Tuesday evening and saw about 15 other students sitting in chairs arranged in a circle, plus several teachers including Peters, the interim principal, and 2 district administrators. The facilitator explained we'd each get time to share our experiences and that the goal was honest conversation and accountability. When my turn came, I told the whole story about Grandma's emergency, about speaking Chinese to save her life, about Tiger's expulsion threat and the months of fighting back. My voice shook, but I got through it, describing the fear of living under constant surveillance and the cost of standing up. Then I listened to others share their stories. A Vietnamese kid who lost valedictorian for humming, a Spanish-speaking girl suspended for saying one word to her mom on the phone, a Haitian student whose parents got banned from campus for speaking Creole in the parking lot. Some administrators genuinely apologized and acknowledged the harm, talking about how the policy was wrong and how they should have spoken up sooner. But others made defensive comments about how they were just following district rules, or how they didn't know it was that bad, trying to explain away their part in it. The session was messy and uncomfortable, with moments of real accountability mixed with excuses and justifications. Still, it created space for conversations that had never happened before, where students could name the trauma, and adults had to sit there and listen. I left feeling the weight of all our collective pain, but also sensing that healing might actually be possible if people kept showing up and doing the hard work. Late January brought frustrating news when Alora texted me a link to a public statement from Tiger's lawyer. The statement said Tiger had hired legal help and was denying any wrongdoing, claiming he'd been enforcing proper educational policies and that the investigation was politically motivated and unfair. The lawyer's statement painted Tiger as a dedicated principal being attacked for maintaining standards, twisting the whole story to make him look like the victim. Rumors started spreading through school that Tiger was planning to sue the district for wrongful termination if they fired him, that he had emails and documents to prove the district had supported his policies for years. The uncertainty about whether he'd actually face real consequences ate at me, this nagging worry that he might get away with everything or even get his job back. I called Mallory frustrated and angry, needing her to tell me this wasn't all for nothing. She reminded me in her calm way that I couldn't control everything, that the legal process would take its own time, and that my part of this fight was mostly done. She pointed out that the policy had changed, that other students were protected now, and that I'd already accomplished more than most people do in a lifetime. Her words helped, but I still felt unsettled, wanting justice to be clear and final instead of messy and uncertain. As spring semester moved toward May and graduation approached, I got called into the counselor's office for a meeting about academic honors. She looked uncomfortable as she explained that because of the suspension on my record, even though it had been reduced to 1 day, I wouldn't be receiving any of the academic honors I'd worked toward for 4 years. No National Honor Society recognition, no academic excellence cords, no special mention at graduation despite my grades and achievements. The rules were clear that any disciplinary action made you ineligible, and there were no exceptions even for my circumstances. I sat there feeling the sting of it, this visible reminder that standing up had cost me recognition I'd earned. The counselor apologized and said she thought it was unfair, but policy was policy. I walked out of her office fighting tears, angry at how the system punished me even after admitting the original policy was wrong. But when I told Mom and Grandma that evening, they immediately started planning their own celebration. Mom requested the day off work weeks in advance, something she rarely did, and Grandma insisted on coming despite her health concerns and the long ceremony. They talked about taking photos and going to my favorite restaurant afterward, making it clear that their presence and pride mattered more than any school recognition. Their support helped ease the hurt, reminding me that the people who really mattered saw what I'd done and valued it regardless of what the school acknowledged. Early June brought an envelope from the state university that I opened with shaking hands at the kitchen table. The acceptance letter congratulated me on admission and included a financial aid package breakdown showing scholarships, grants, and the loans and work study I'd need to cover the rest. It wasn't the full-ride scholarship I'd dreamed about before all this happened, before the suspension and the lost honors and the damaged transcript. The package was modest and would mean taking on debt and working through college, making things harder than I'd hoped. But it was real and it was possible. An actual path forward to study public policy and health advocacy at a decent school. I read through the acceptance materials describing the programs and opportunities, feeling cautiously optimistic about building a future focused on the issues I'd learned to care about through this whole experience. The fight had changed what I wanted to do with my life, had shown me how much policy and advocacy mattered, had given me a purpose beyond just getting good grades. I signed the acceptance forms and mailed them back, committing to this imperfect but meaningful path forward. The week before graduation, I volunteered to help clean out old administrative offices being reorganized under the new interim principal. I was sorting through boxes in a storage room when I found several marked with Tiger's name, his belongings being packed away for whatever came next. One box sat open, and I looked inside to see his infamous trophy wall photos, the pictures of expelled students he'd displayed like hunting prizes. I pulled them out one by one, looking at the faces of kids whose futures he'd damaged, seeing their names and violation dates written on the backs. Some I recognized from the school, others had graduated or disappeared before I knew them, but each photo represented a life disrupted by his cruelty. Standing there in that dusty storage room holding evidence of systematic harm, I made a quiet promise to myself about the future I wanted to build. I would study policy and advocacy work, would learn how to dismantle systems that hurt vulnerable people, would use what I'd learned from this experience to prevent it from happening to others. My path forward wasn't perfect or easy, wasn't the prestigious scholarship and honor-filled graduation I'd once imagined, but it was mine, and it was meaningful, shaped by this fight into something I could actually be proud of, something that might help protect the next kid who had to choose between following unjust rules and doing what was right. That's the story for today. I'm really grateful you took the time to listen because moments like this remind me why I love sharing stories. I hope it added a bit of warmth to your day. Subscribe if you'd like to keep this little routine going.